The clock struck midnight, and in the suffocating stillness of Purley Manor, a single candle flickered, its frail light barely holding back the shadows that had long hidden the truth. Somewhere within these walls, a secret waited, coiled like a serpent in the dark, ready to strike, and tonight it would. Miss Marple sat at her small kitchen table as the morning sun streamed lazily through the lace curtains, a neatly arranged china cup of tea, a perfectly toasted slice of bread with just the right spread of marmalade, and her knitting needles lay close at hand. Outside, sparrows quarreled in the ivy creeping up her cottage wall. It was a morning like any other, calm, predictable, just the way she liked it. But the tranquility was shattered by the sharp rap of the knocker. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the clock on the mantel, 9:30, early for visitors, unless of course there was news. And in St. Mary Mead, news travelled faster than a cat chasing cream. Opening the door, she found Mrs. Price Ridley standing there, her cheeks flushed, breath slightly short. Without invitation, she swept inside, the familiarity of someone long accustomed to being received. "Jane, have you heard?" Her voice carried urgency. "No, of course you haven't. You never do." Miss Marple gave a patient smile. "What has happened, Mrs.?" Price Ridley flung a gloved hand dramatically. "Richard Holcombe has been arrested." Miss Marple stirred her tea, unperturbed. "Oh, and why is that?" "Embezzlement." Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward, eyes gleaming, "and murder." The last word was whispered, as if too scandalous to say aloud. Murder. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but a flicker of thought passed through her sharp mind. Yes. Thomas Whittaker, found dead in his study, door locked from the inside, and they say Holcombe lost a fortune in that failed venture of theirs. Motive enough, wouldn't you say? The mention of Whittaker conjured an image of a burly man, loud and overbearing, not known for making friends easily. "And Margaret?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Losing a husband so suddenly must be dreadful." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Margaret always acted as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. But people talk, Jane. They say she's been seen visiting Judge Langley rather frequently." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened ever so slightly. "Judge Langley? Oh yes," Mrs. Price Ridley huffed, adjusting her oversized hat. "He's presiding over the case. A man of impeccable character, of course, but that won't stop tongues from wagging." She finished her tea, sighing contentedly. "Well, I must dash, Mrs. Bantry will want the latest," and with that she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and self-righteousness. For a moment Miss Marple sat still. Outside, the village carried on as always. Children's laughter echoed from the green. A milk cart rattled down the lane, but beneath the surface something shifted. A familiar hum of unease lingered in the air. Appearances deceived, and in St. Mary Mead, truth was rarely what it seemed. Later that morning, Miss Marple tied on her sensible hat and stepped into the crisp air. She wasn't one to pry unnecessarily, but some matters were worth looking into, and the village shop was where fact and fiction often traded places. The bell jingled as she entered. Shelves overflowed with tins, boxes of biscuits, and bolts of fabric. Behind the counter, Mr. Simmons wiped his hands on a once white apron. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted. "Chilly one today, papers just in full of that Holcombe business. Terrible thing." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, glancing at the counter's display of barley sugars. "Terrible." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned Judge Langley's involvement." Mr. Simmons leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Bit of talk, that. Margaret Whittaker's been seen at his house more than once. Could be innocent, of course, but folk do wonder." From the back, young Jenny, the shop assistant, appeared carrying a crate of apples. "Innocent," she scoffed. "My aunt says Margaret and Judge Langley were thick as thieves before she even married Thomas." Mr. Simmons shot her a warning look, though not too harshly. Gossip, after all. was currency here. Miss Marple bought a quarter-pound of tea biscuits, offering a mild smile. It's so easy to assume things, isn't it? People visit for all sorts of reasons: friendship, charity, necessity. Jenny muttered, stacking apples, funny word for it. Miss Marple stepped outside, breathing in the cold, bracing air. The mystery had only just begun. Miss Marple paused on the worn cobbled path, her sharp eyes sweeping over the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead. Beyond the distant hills, market chipping bustled with its relentless pace, but here, life moved slower, too slow sometimes for secrets to remain buried. The crunch of her steps echoed in the hush of the crisp autumn morning, mingling with the distant toll of the church bell and the soft clink of china from a nearby tea-room. Gossip was the village's lifeblood, and today the air was thick with it. At the heart of it all lay the trial: Richard Holcombe, accused of both embezzlement and the cold-blooded murder of his business partner, Thomas Whittaker. The courthouse in Market Chipping had swallowed the village whole, its presence a looming shadow that stretched even to this quiet lane. Inside the courtroom, the tension was a living thing, pressing against the wooden beams and swirling through the whispering crowd. Miss Marple took her place at the back, beside Mrs. Price Ridley, whose enormous feathered hat trembled with excitement. The gallery was packed with a motley mix of villagers, each eager to witness the spectacle unfold. The scent of old paper, polished oak, and the faint musk of damp wool filled the space, an undertone to the quiet murmurs crawling across the benches. In the defendant's chair, Richard Holcombe sat unmoving, his tailored black suit impeccable, but unable to hide the rigid set of his jaw, or the calculating flicker in his sharp blue eyes. His hands rested on the table, still, but not quite relaxed. Margaret Whittaker, the widow of the deceased, sat a few rows away, veiled in black, her posture stiff, her fingers locked in a tense grip against the fabric of her dress. Her grief, if real, was restrained, her face an unreadable mask. The only betrayal of emotion lay in her trembling hands. Whether from sorrow or something more complex, Miss Marple could not yet tell. At the judge's bench, Sir Edmund Langley loomed, his dark robes swallowing the light, his expression carved from stone. His voice, deep and commanding, cut through the room with a weight that made it clear: this was no ordinary trial. Richard Holcombe is charged with the embezzlement of funds and the murder of his business partner Thomas Whittaker, Sir Edmund announced, his tone deliberate, his gaze unwavering. The prosecution will now lay out its case. A thin, sharp-faced man rose, the prosecutor, his every movement precise, as if he were piecing together a puzzle whose edges had already been defined. He spoke of Holcombe's financial dealings, whispered investments, illicit transactions, debts mounting like storm clouds. He painted a portrait of a man backed into a corner, a man who had only one way out. The courtroom seemed to shrink as his words tightened around the accused like an iron vise. The gallery leaned in, breath held, eyes wide, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of shifting weight on old benches. Holcombe remained still, too still. His only betrayal was a single-minute twitch of his fingers before they curled into a fist. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A man does not sit untouched beneath the weight of accusation unless he is either supremely confident or supremely calculating. The prosecution pressed on, detailing the stormy history between Holcombe and Whittaker. Whittaker, loud and brash, had been the face of their venture, but Holcombe had the mind, the means, the quiet, unshakable control. And now the prosecution argued he had the motive, to silence his partner before his empire collapsed. The whispers thickened, rising like a tide, but Miss Marple was listening to something else. A gap, a thread, not quite aligned in the prosecutor's neatly woven tale. There was something they were not saying, something that made the air feel just slightly off-kilter. Before she could pin it down, a sudden rustle of movement broke the proceedings. A clerk approached Sir Edmund, a plain white envelope in hand. The judge took it with careful fingers, his face a mask, until it wasn't. A flicker, almost imperceptible, darkened his eyes before he schooled his features once more. The room held its breath, the moment stretched. "Then a recess is hereby ordered," Sir Edmund declared, his voice striking like the gavel against wood. "We will reconvene after a short break." The gallery erupted into murmurs, the charged energy crackling through the air. Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Price Ridley, who was already clucking her tongue in delighted scandal. But Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. The judge's reaction had been too controlled, too deliberate. Whatever had been in that envelope, it had shifted something. The trial had reached its tipping point, and yet no one in this room realized just how close they stood to the edge of revelation. On a cold morning, as fog wrapped around the old cobbled streets, Miss Eliza Thornfield made her way toward the vicarage with measured steps. St. Briar's Hollow, a small village that only seemed alive in daylight, held secrets in every corner. But today, those secrets were not just whispers, they hung in the air like a sharpened blade. Inside the courtroom, every face reflected either fear or anticipation, but none were as striking as Judge Walden Grave's troubled expression. A man of great reputation, yet today his voice carried a slight tremor, one that only an observant eye like Miss Thornfield's could detect. "A court order has been delivered to me," he announced, his fingers tightening around an unmarked letter. A letter alleging my prior connection to Miss Evelyn Blackwood. The name wasn't just a name, it was an explosion in the silent room. Evelyn Blackwood, the wealthy widow whose husband, Edward Blackwood, had been found dead under grim circumstances just months ago. His body had been discovered in an abandoned tunnel, eyes wide open as if he had seen death coming for him. And now this letter was more than a scandal, it was a shift in the very foundation of the trial. As the murmurs spread like wildfire, Miss Thornfield caught a flicker of something on Evelyn's face, a smile, faint but telling. Was it unease? Or was it satisfaction? "This trial," Judge Walden's voice rang out, "cannot proceed under these conditions. I must recuse myself." For a moment, the courtroom fell into an unnatural silence, but Miss Thornfield's mind was racing with a single thought: who had sent this letter? Was it merely to create scandal, or to bury something far darker? Outside, the air was crisp, but the conversations were heated. Near the vicarage, a small crowd had gathered, where Mrs. Greta Holloway, always in search of the next juicy tale, leaned in conspiratorially. "Did you hear?" she whispered. "The judge and Evelyn, I always knew there was something strange about her." But Miss Thornfield's mind was elsewhere. Whoever had sent that letter had not only targeted the judge, but had clouded the entire truth. In this village, secrets lurked beneath every stone, but the real question remained: would the truth ever come to light, or would it too become just another buried mystery of St. Briar's Hollow? The afternoon air was thick with the scent of damp earth as Miss Evelyn Harcourt stepped through the iron gates of Ashworth Manor. The village of Ravenshire was still, its silence unnatural, broken only by the distant cawing of crows that circled above the towering estate. She had seen scandals before, lived through them even, but something about this particular turn of events sent a chill through her bones. The trial of Edward Blackwood's alleged murderer had been reaching its crescendo when, without warning, an anonymous letter had brought it all crumbling down. Judge Randall Whitmore, a man known for his unshakable presence, had paled at the words written in that letter, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he read its contents aloud. A claim of an undisclosed past relationship with the accused, Lillian Blackwood. Gasps had filled the courtroom, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the crowd like a storm about to break. The judge had no choice but to step down, and in that moment the truth, the real truth, had been buried beneath another layer of deception. Evelyn had her suspicions. The timing was too perfect, the letter too convenient. Whoever had orchestrated this had intended not just to derail the trial but to ensure that the real culprit remained hidden. As she approached the manor's grand entrance, the heavy door creaked open before she could knock, revealing the imposing figure of Lawrence Blackwood, the late Edward's brother, His eyes, dark as coal, scrutinized her from the threshold. "Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice even, "I wasn't expecting you." "Few ever do," Evelyn replied smoothly, stepping past him into the dimly lit foyer. The air inside was heavy with the scent of aged wood and something else, something metallic, like blood that had long since dried. "I assume you're here about the trial," Lawrence continued, leading her into a drawing room where firelight cast restless shadows against the walls, or rather its abrupt halt. Evelyn lowered herself into an armchair, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain teacup that had been left untouched on the table. "The letter," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "It arrived precisely when it was needed most, didn't it?" Lawrence's lips curled slightly. "Coincidences do happen." "In Ravenshire?" "Hardly," Evelyn countered. "Someone wanted Judge Whitmore off that bench, and I suspect it wasn't just to expose an indiscretion." She leaned forward, her voice dipping into something colder. "This trial is no longer about justice, Mr. Blackwood. It's about control, and someone very clever, is pulling the strings." A long silence stretched between them before Lawrence finally exhaled, his gaze shifting toward the rain-lashed windows. "Then I suppose the real question is, what are you willing to do to cut those strings?" Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and Evelyn knew this was no longer a case of murder alone. This was a game of power, of secrets hidden beneath layers of deception, and she was only just beginning to unravel it. The study bore the weight of silence, an unspoken presence lurking between the shadows of towering bookcases and the grand oak desk that sat untouched in the center of the room. The chair behind it was slightly askew, as if abandoned in haste, and the door showed no signs of forced entry. The windows, locked from within, reflected only the dim glow of the oil lamp flickering in the corner. Yet despite the stillness, something unsettled Miss Eleanor Graves. A whisper of cold air curled around the edges of the bookcase, carrying with it a scent that did not belong, a damp, earthy trace, like stone corridors hidden beneath the floor. Her gloved fingers skimmed along the grain of the wood, stopping at a barely perceptible crack. "A draught," she murmured, her voice no louder than a breath. "Curious." Behind her Lady Margaret Blackwell stiffened. "The house is old, Miss Graves. It has its peculiarities." But there was something too sharp in the way she spoke, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap, her lips pressed thin enough to pale. Miss Graves turned, her gaze settling on the figure standing in the hallway beyond the threshold. The housekeeper, Edith Cromwell, loomed just out of reach of the lamplight, her gaze unreadable, her expression fixed in a careful neutrality that betrayed nothing, except perhaps the fact that she had been listening. "Good evening, Mrs. Cromwell," Miss Graves said smoothly, watching for any flicker of reaction. None came, save for the smallest tightening of the woman's jaw before she turned on her heel and disappeared down the corridor. Yes, Miss Graves thought, the Blackwell estate held secrets, woven deep into its walls, wrapped in veils of propriety. The village of Hawthorne was much the same, a place where politeness masked the slow decay of truth. Its cobbled streets and ivy-clad cottages stood pristine, untouched by time, but behind closed doors, resentment festered, grievances were whispered rather than spoken, and grudges passed down like heirlooms. From her sitting-room window, she watched the familiar rhythm of the village, the postman's steady shuffle, the baker's apprentice dusting flour from his apron, the reverend pausing in front of the church, as though waiting for something unseen. Everything appeared as it always had, but Miss Graves knew better. Something had shifted. The door creaked open behind her, breaking her thoughts. Mrs. Edith Pembroke swept in, her ever-present shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes alight with barely contained intrigue. "Eleanor, you won't believe what I've just been told," she announced, setting down a wicker basket on the table, a collection of fresh vegetables spilling from within. James Blackwell's son, Henry, was seen arguing with his father just days before the murder. Quite the scene, I'm told. Raised voices, accusations, Not the sort of thing one shouts unless one is desperate. Miss Graves did not move, her gaze still on the quiet streets beyond the window. Desperate, Mrs. Pembroke, she mused, tilting her head slightly, or determined. Mrs. Pembroke scoffed, lowering herself onto the settee with practiced ease. Determined to get his hands on his inheritance, if you ask me. James Blackwell never had the patience for sentiment, you know. He was a man of wealth first, a father second. The words settled like dust in the air, lingering, waiting to be disturbed. Miss Graves turned at last, her expression thoughtful. And was there a will? Mrs. Pembroke leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Indeed there was. A pause. But I dare say it may not have been to everyone's liking. Miss Graves exhaled slowly, the weight of something unseen pressing against her thoughts. A son at odds with his father, a study with no forced entry, a draft where there should be none, and a house where secrets breathed just beneath the surface. The pieces of the puzzle were there, scattered and waiting, and Eleanor Graves was nothing if not skilled at putting them together. The fire in the sitting room crackled softly, its glow casting flickering shadows along the walls as Miss Eleanor Graves carefully poured herself a cup of tea, her movements unhurried, deliberate. The scent of bergamot curled into the air, mingling with the lingering aroma of old books and polished mahogany, a scent that spoke of years of quiet contemplation within these very walls. Outside, the village moved as it always did, a slow, measured rhythm of life, but within the grand Blackwell estate, the air was thick with something unseen, something unsettling, a tension that clung to the drapes and pooled in the corners like an unspoken secret, waiting to be unearthed. The argument had been heard by nearly everyone, Henry Blackwell's voice carrying through the halls like the distant rumble of an approaching storm, words of resentment and accusations laced with the bitterness of long-standing disappointment. Witnesses spoke in hushed tones of the way Thomas Blackwell the patriarch had stood unmoved, his expression cold and unwavering even as his son's fury rose. And now Thomas Blackwell was dead, his lifeless body discovered in the study, slumped over the great oak desk that had once been the seat of his authority. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, just the finality of death in a house where power had long been the only currency that mattered. Now Henry stood before Miss Graves, his posture rigid, his fingers twitching at his sides, as though struggling to contain something deeper than frustration. His eyes, dark and shadowed, flickered with unreadable emotion. "You think I did it, don't you?" His voice was sharp, defensive, but there was something else beneath it, something raw. Miss Graves set her cup down gently, folding her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. "I think," she said, her voice cool as a winter breeze, "that people often reveal more in what they try to hide." He scoffed, shaking his head, but he did not move. A guilty man would have stormed out by now. A fearful one would have faltered. Henry Blackwell did neither. Outside, the church bells tolled, marking the slow, inevitable passage of time. The weight of the moment settled between them, heavy as the silence that followed. The will, that was what had driven the wedge between father and son, what had set events in motion. Thomas Blackwell had always been a man who measured his affections in wealth and control, and Henry, the only heir, had always bristled under that weight. The staff at the estate knew something, Edith Cromwell most of all. She had been in service for decades, her presence a silent fixture in the halls of the manor, and yet, something in her watchful gaze, in the careful way she measured her work, he suggested she held knowledge far more dangerous than simple household secrets. Miss Graves had seen it before, that tension, that silent weight that pressed against a person's shoulders when they carried too much truth. Mrs. Pembroke, the cook, had whispered of promises made and broken, of resentments buried beneath years of feigned loyalty. And then there was the matter of the study itself, locked from the inside, no clear sign of struggle, and yet a faint draught had been detected near the bookcase, a whisper of air where there should have been none. A secret passage, perhaps. A hidden truth concealed in the very walls of the house. Miss Graves let her gaze settle back on Henry, studying the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. He was angry. But was it the anger of a man accused unjustly, or the simmering rage of someone who had finally been pushed too far? The Blackwell estate was not merely a house with history, it was a place where power had been wielded like a weapon, where loyalty had been tested, and where someone somewhere had decided that silence was no longer an option. And yet, there was something else, something beneath the surface, a truth more dangerous than mere greed or resentment. Miss Graves could feel it, the pieces shifting, the puzzle beginning to take shape. She took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze never leaving Henry. "You say you didn't do it," she murmured, her voice soft, almost contemplative. "But someone did, and the truth, Henry, has a way of surfacing whether we want it to or not." A flicker of something fear, perhaps, crossed his face, gone in an instant. The pieces were shifting, and Miss Graves, with quiet certainty, knew she was about to pull the right thread. The heavy grandfather clock in the dimly lit study ticked away the silence, its rhythmic chime slicing through the thick air, as Eleanor Blackwood folded her hands over the polished desk. The glow from a single lamp cast long wavering shadows against the mahogany-paneled walls, dancing between the rows of leather-bound books that smelled of dust and time. Across from her, Edward Hastings sat rigid, his fingers twitching slightly against the armrest of his chair, his face set in a hard, unreadable mask. The faint scent of brandy and tobacco lingered between them, a remnant of the past that had clung to these walls long before the murder that had shattered the household. "You were there the night your father died." Eleanor's voice was soft, almost contemplative, but her keen gaze did not waver. "At the club, I believe. Drinking, gambling, drowning in debts you couldn't afford to repay." Edward's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering away for the briefest of moments before snapping back. "I was at the club," he admitted, his voice clipped, controlled. "Half the town saw me. You can ask George Wallace, James Barrett, they were all there. I couldn't have done it." "And yet," Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting lightly against the desk, "your father changed his will mere days before his death. And I suppose it's merely coincidence that you were the one set to lose everything." A muscle twitched in Edward's jaw, his shoulders stiffening under the weight of her words. "I didn't know about the change," he muttered. "Not until after he was gone." "You're certain?" Eleanor's tone was mild, but her eyes bore into him like scalpels, peeling away at the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. "You didn't overhear a conversation? A letter, perhaps?" Edward hesitated, his fingers instinctively moving to the cuff of his sleeve, fidgeting. It was a small gesture, but it told Eleanor everything she needed to know. He was lying, not outright, but withholding something, a crucial detail he wasn't ready to share. "Let's talk about that, Will," she continued smoothly, as if she hadn't noticed his hesitation. "Your father had been threatening to cut you off for years, but this time he went through with it. And yet, the document is missing. Strange, isn't it?" Edward exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It's with his lawyer, I assume. That's where it should be." "Should be." Eleanor let the words linger. "But it isn't." A flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossed Edward's face. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by the same rigid defensiveness he had walked in with. But Eleanor had seen it. He knew more than he was letting on. "Do you know who might have wanted that will to disappear?" she asked. "Because you see, without it the old will remains in place, and under that, you inherit everything." Edward's hands clenched into fists, his face darkening. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm considering possibilities," Eleanor said evenly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "And here's another. Your father was found locked inside his study. No sign of forced entry, no struggle. Poison perhaps, a slow-acting one, something that wouldn't leave a trace until it was too late." His expression barely flickered, but she caught it, the slightest shift, the brief tightening of his mouth. He was thinking of something, or someone. "Who else was in the house that night?" she continued, her voice calm, relentless. "The housekeeper, Miss Halford. She's been with your family for years, and then there's Robert, your father's trusted secretary. A loyal man, or so it seemed." Edward exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're reaching, Eleanor. My father had enemies, plenty of them. Maybe it wasn't about the will at all." "Perhaps," she murmured, though she didn't believe it for a second. She rose from her chair, stepping toward the window, where the night pressed against the glass like a restless ghost. The house was silent now, but secrets had a way of whispering through the walls. "You say you couldn't have done it," she said, turning back to him. "And maybe you didn't, but someone did, and I suspect you know exactly who." Edward's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his hands tightening around the armrest of the chair. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Eleanor smiled faintly, stepping past him toward the door. "Good night, Edward," she said lightly. "Sleep well, if you can." She didn't need to turn around to know he was still sitting there, motionless, trapped in the weight of his own thoughts. The pieces were shifting, and soon, very soon, she would pull the right thread and unravel everything. The evening was settling in, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead. A chill had crept into the air, rustling through the withered leaves and whispering secrets among the stone buildings. Miss Eleanor Graves, gripping her small umbrella in one hand, and the weight of unspoken thoughts in the other, made her way toward the rear of Whittaker Manor. This was not a simple visit, it was a search, a pursuit of a truth that had long been buried under years of silence. Nestled in a forgotten corner of the estate was an old withering garden, its flowers long dead, and its trees standing like weary sentinels of the past. Hidden among them was a small wooden shed, its exterior worn by time, its purpose long forsaken, or so it seemed. Eleanor slowed her pace as she approached, the sensation of being watched prickling at the back of her neck. Yet, the only witness here was the biting wind and the dry earth beneath her feet. Then something caught her eye, an old rusted lock, clinging stubbornly to the shed's door, but the soil beneath it told a different story. Unlike the rest of the untouched ground, this patch was disturbed, as though someone had recently tampered with it. Eleanor hesitated, then reached out to test the lock. It held firm, unwilling to give away its secrets so easily. A soft sound broke the silence, footsteps, deliberate and measured. Turning swiftly, Eleanor found herself face to face with Eliza Gray, the longtime housekeeper of Whittaker Manor. The woman's face was composed, her gaze cool, yet there was something else lurking beneath her calm exterior, something that didn't belong in the face of an innocent bystander. "What brings you here, Miss Graves?" Eliza's voice was polite, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath the surface. Eleanor offered a knowing smile. "Just looking for a few answers. I suspect they might be hiding nearby." Eliza's hands smoothed over the folds of her apron, a flicker of unease flashing across her face before she quickly masked it. "This shed has been locked for years. Sir Thomas never wanted anyone near it. He said some memories were his alone to keep." "Memories? Or something else?" Eleanor asked, watching Eliza closely. For a moment, the housekeeper held her gaze, but then she turned away. "The manor is growing colder, Miss Graves. You should return inside." Without another word she walked away, her stiff posture betraying more than she likely intended. But Eleanor remained. Her thoughts were still on the disturbed earth, the silent testimony of something that had been moved, hidden, or perhaps uncovered. Before the night was over, Eleanor sought out Inspector Bradshaw, a pragmatic man who believed in hard evidence, not whispered secrets. "If you have a solid lead, Miss Graves, now is the time to share it," he said, eyeing her with skepticism. "Stories are evidence, Inspector. And this one has only just begun," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. Later that night, when the village lay in slumber, she returned to the shed. A small torch in hand, she cast a beam of light over the ground. Carefully, she began brushing away the dirt. Within moments, her fingers met something solid, an old wooden box half buried beneath the soil. But just as she reached for it, her torchlight caught something else, a new gleaming padlock, untouched by rust, glaring back at her. This secret was not abandoned. Someone was still protecting it. The heavy silence of the old estate wrapped around them like a shroud, thick with the weight of secrets buried beneath years of quiet service and whispered betrayals. Inspector Caldwell, his patience stretched thin, watched with a scowl as Evelyn Harrow, the ever-perceptive woman whose keen eye had unsettled more criminals than he cared to count, traced her gloved fingers along the edges of the grand study's bookshelves. The scent of aged paper, mingled with something else, something colder, a breath of air, faint but undeniable, danced along the nape of her neck, setting her on edge. There was something hidden here, something left to be discovered. With a practiced touch, she pressed against the barely visible seam of a panel, nestled between the weighty tomes, and with a reluctant groan, the bookcase shifted, revealing a narrow passageway shrouded in darkness. Caldwell's gruff skepticism faltered, his breath catching as the implications sank in. "A damn secret corridor," he muttered, stepping closer, his lantern casting long wavering shadows against the aged walls. The passage was suffocatingly narrow, dust swirling in the air disturbed by their presence. The scent of damp wood, and something more acrid, something metallic, lingered. Blood. Someone had been here, but not long enough for the evidence to fade. Evelyn moved forward without hesitation, her sharp gaze scanning the stone walls, following the trail of disturbed dust that led toward the hidden doorway at the far end. It opened seamlessly into the dimly lit pantry, its shelves lined with jars long since abandoned. The back door of the estate stood mere feet away. "An easy escape route," she murmured. Someone left the study unnoticed. Someone who knew this passage existed. Caldwell exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "And I suppose you think that someone was Eleanor Langley?" Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up a fragment of fabric, caught on the edge of the passage's entrance, a piece of dark wool, stiff with age but fresh enough to matter. "I think," she said slowly, "that Eleanor knew more than she let on, but whether she fled the scene, or simply found it after the fact is yet to be determined." Caldwell scowled but said nothing. The weight of the discovery was beginning to settle over him, the realization that their neatly packaged case had unraveled into something far more insidious. And then there was the matter of the object. Evelyn had slipped into her palm, her fingers tightening around it as she stepped back into the study. A cigar stub, barely smoked, left as if in a hurry. Not a mistake, not an accident, but a clue left behind by someone who never expected to be followed this far. Evelyn met Caldwell's gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "The real question isn't just who was in that study that night, it's who else was watching." The grand drawing room of Ashford Manor was silent, but it was the heavy, watchful kind of silence that felt alive with the weight of secrets. The air smelled of polished wood, and dying embers in the fireplace, the glow casting long jagged shadows along the walls. Eleanor Winslow sat stiffly in a velvet chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but the whiteness of her knuckles betrayed the tension lurking beneath her composed exterior. Across from her, Jonathan Ashford, the last heir of the crumbling estate, leaned against the mantel, his fingers drumming against the wood in an unsteady rhythm. He was not a man accustomed to waiting, and yet, he had no choice. Beside him, Margaret Hale stood with the practiced stillness of a woman who had spent her life in service, her face undone. But the true focus of the room was Evelyn Mole, with a quiet elegance, set a small worn pocket watch on the table. Its hands had stopped at exactly 9:15 p.m. "This," she said, her voice even but sharp enough to cut through the thick air, "is the moment you would all like us to believe the murder happened. But that, I'm afraid, is a carefully constructed lie." A flicker of movement, a tightening of Jonathan's jaw, the quick flick of Margaret's eyes toward the door, the barely perceptible way Eleanor's fingers twitched. They were all waiting, watching, calculating. Inspector Alden, standing by the window, exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. "You're saying the time of death was staged?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Evelyn merely nodded, tracing her fingertips lightly over the cracked glass of the pocket watch. Whoever left this behind wanted to create a false narrative, an illusion of precision, where there was none. It's a common trick. The only real question is, why? Jonathan scoffed, crossing his arms. Perhaps the watch simply broke. No, Evelyn countered smoothly. It was broken on purpose, just like the cigar stub found near the fireplace, one that doesn't match the brand you claim to smoke, Jonathan. And yet, it was left there, as if waiting to be discovered. Silence followed, thick and uneasy. Alden stepped forward, his keen gaze sweeping over the room. We're not playing games anymore. Someone in this house knew about the hidden passage behind the bookcase. It leads directly to the servants' quarters, and the dust was disturbed recently, which means someone used it either to escape unseen or to ensure someone else's exit. Margaret, for the first time, reacted. A sharp inhale, a flicker of something, fear, regret. Evelyn turned to her, her voice softer now, almost coaxing. You knew about it, didn't you? You've been in this house longer than anyone. It's easy to miss, but not for someone who's moved through these walls for years. And yet, you said nothing. Margaret remained silent, but her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. Evelyn continued, her voice almost gentle. Did you see who used it? No, Margaret whispered, too quickly. Then, realizing her mistake, she corrected herself. I mean, I don't know, but you do know, Evelyn pressed, because you helped them. Jonathan straightened, his expression darkening. That's absurd. You're fishing for something that isn't there. Evelyn smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Am I? She picked up the pocket watch once more, holding it up so the dim light gleamed against the fractured glass. This didn't belong to the victim. It belonged to the person who was with him last. And that person is in this room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alden, his patience finally exhausted, took a step forward, his voice sharp. Enough games, this ends now. But Evelyn wasn't looking at him. She was watching Eleanor, who had finally for the first time all evening looked afraid. The truth was there, waiting to be spoken. The final act of the game had begun, and soon someone would have to pay the price. The heavy silence in Ravensshire Hall was suffocating, wrapping itself around the gathered guests like an unseen vice. The grand study, once a place of quiet contemplation, had become an arena of accusation, with each occupant trapped in their own private storm of suspicion. The towering bookshelves cast elongated shadows under the flickering light of the chandelier, the faint scent of aged paper and burning wood mixing with something more elusive, fear. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down upon them, making the air thick, unbreathable. Lady Eleanor Lockwood sat rigidly in her high-backed chair, her fingers trembling ever so slightly against the silk of her gown. Her face, pale as the moonlight filtering through the heavy drapes, was a mask of control that barely hid the fractures beneath. The usual commanding presence of the lady of the house had waned, replaced with a woman drained, haunted by the whispers of ghosts yet to be named. Across from her, Henry Lockwood, her stepson, stared intently at the broken pocket watch placed on the polished mahogany table, its glass fractured, the hands forever frozen at 9:15 p.m. A lie carved in time. His normally assured posture was stiff, his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein twitched at his temple. Beside him, Beatrice Langley, the ever-composed governess, stood near the fireplace, her gaze flickering between the watch and the room's other occupants. She had always been an observer, a quiet fixture in the household, but tonight her stillness seemed less like composure and more like restraint. Her hands were folded, the fingers digging into her gloves, and yet she met no one's gaze directly, as though afraid that one glance could betray what she truly knew. And then there was Thomas Renly, the solicitor, his fingers tightened into fists at his sides, his face unreadable but his body tense, as though bracing for an inevitable blow. He had spent years crafting his expression into one of impassive professionalism, yet tonight the fine cracks in his demeanor showed, betraying an unease he could not suppress. Inspector Harrington, a man whose presence carried the weight of unspoken truths, stood at the head of the room, his stance firm, his presence commanding. The glint in his eyes suggested that he had already unraveled more than the others suspected. Yet, it was Evelyn Hargrave, the sharp-eyed woman who had orchestrated this final meeting, who truly commanded the moment. She moved with an air of quiet authority, a woman who knew more than she let on. With slow deliberation, she picked up the broken pocket watch, turning it in her hands, her touch lingering over the fractured glass. "This watch," she said, her voice smooth but piercing, "wasn't broken by accident. It was placed here, staged to create the illusion that Lord Lockwood was murdered precisely at 9:15 p.m. But the truth," she paused, letting the words sink in, "is something far more insidious." A subtle shift rippled through the room. Henry exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping against his chair's armrest, his unease plain. Beatrice, ever silent, tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. But it was Eleanor whose reaction was the most telling. Her grip tightened just slightly, a barely perceptible movement, but one Evelyn caught. The lady of the house was trying to maintain her poise, but the faintest flicker of something, was it fear or guilt, flashed across her otherwise serene features. Someone, Evelyn continued, setting the watch down with a soft clink, wanted to control the narrative of this crime. "The question is why?" Thomas Renly scoffed, crossing his arms. "Or perhaps," he said, his voice edged with defiance, "the watch simply broke in the struggle." Evelyn's lips curled into a small knowing smile, an understandable assumption, but incorrect. "The fracture pattern on the glass suggests it was struck against a hard surface deliberately, not in a moment of chaos. A calculated effort to deceive. And then there's the letter." The air in the room tightened. Eleanor's eyes flickered, but she remained silent. Henry, however, leaned forward, his voice sharp. "What letter?" Inspector Harrington unfolded a worn parchment from his coat pocket. "This was found in Lord Lockwood's private safe, addressed to an unknown recipient. It speaks of a debt unpaid, a secret buried deep within this very house." Beatrice, for the first time, spoke, her voice low and careful. "A secret?" Evelyn turned her piercing gaze toward her. "Yes, one that someone in this room has killed to keep hidden." Another ripple of silence, but this time it was suffused with something darker, fear. Henry's hands clenched, the knuckles going white. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her face suddenly unreadable. Beatrice's gaze lowered, an unnatural stillness in her demeanor. Thomas adjusted his stance, his breathing measured, his nostrils flaring ever so slightly. "I would suggest," Evelyn said, stepping closer to the table, her tone razor-sharp, "that this is not just about money, or inheritance, or resentment." She let the weight of her words linger before delivering the final blow. "This is about revenge." Eleanor finally reacted. A sharp inhale, a flicker of something unguarded in her eyes. Henry shot to his feet, but Evelyn's voice cut through his movement. "Sit down, Mr. Lockwood. We're not done yet." The fire crackled in the silence. Outside, the wind howled against the stained glass windows, as if the house itself could sense the truth clawing its way to the surface. The rain tapped against the panes like fingers urging them forward, demanding the final revelation. "Someone in this room," Evelyn said, her voice a whisper of finality, "is not who they claim to be, and tonight we will uncover the truth." The storm outside raged on, but inside Ravenshire Hall, the real storm was just beginning. The heavy velvet drapes of Ashbourne Manor's study shuddered as a storm raged outside, casting jagged shadows against the walls lined with ancient tomes. Eleanor Whitmore sat rigid in her chair, her trembling fingers clutching the edge of the desk as if steadying herself against an unseen force. Across from her, Henry Whitmore paced, his polished shoes tapping against the hardwood floor, a measured, practiced rhythm that barely concealed the storm brewing within him. Beatrice Langley stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, face unreadable, while Richard Halstead, the family solicitor, watched from the periphery, his sharp eyes flicking between them all, as though piecing together a puzzle only he could see. Inspector Graves finally broke the silence, his voice a deep, unwavering presence. The letter that surfaced, its timing was too precise, too deliberate. A scandal buried for decades suddenly brought to light at the very moment Thomas Whitmore is murdered. Coincidence? His gaze settled on Eleanor, whose grip on the desk tightened. "I had nothing to do with it," she whispered, but her voice lacked its usual resolve. Evelyn Hargrave, who had until now remained silent, finally stepped forward. "Eleanor, you knew about the blackmail," she said softly, almost coaxingly. "But what you haven't told us is why it was important enough to kill for." The room tensed. Henry's pacing stopped. Beatrice's lips curled slightly, a ghost of a smirk or perhaps something more sinister. Richard shifted, as if weighing his next words carefully. Then before anyone could speak, Evelyn moved toward the farthest wall, her fingers grazing the spines of the books. "There's something else," she murmured. "Something hidden." The click was almost imperceptible, but the effect was immediate. A section of the bookcase groaned and shifted, revealing a narrow passage shrouded in darkness. The revelation sent a current of unease through the room. Beatrice's fingers twitched at her side. Henry's jaw tightened. "An escape route," Evelyn said, "a direct path from this study to the back entrance." The study was locked from the inside, but someone left this way. She turned sharply. Someone who knew this house well, someone who wanted us to believe the murder was impossible. Eleanor's face paled further. Henry let out a slow, measured breath. "And yet," Evelyn continued, her voice now a knife's edge, "this isn't just about access, it's about manipulation. Someone in this room didn't just want Thomas Whitmore dead, they wanted someone else to take the fall." Inspector Graves's gaze darkened. "A false lead?" Evelyn nodded. "One designed to keep us chasing shadows while the real mastermind remained in the light." A heavy silence fell. Outside thunder rolled, deep and resounding, as if echoing the weight of the moment. Then with slow, deliberate intent, Evelyn turned to Richard Halstead, her eyes locking onto his with quiet certainty. "Tell me, Richard," she said, "when exactly did Thomas Whitmore last change his will?" The musty air of Ashton Court's study clung thick with the scent of aged parchment and wax-sealed envelopes, as if the very walls held secrets unwilling to be unearthed. The room's heavy oak desk bore the weight of scattered documents, the most significant of which lay beneath Evelyn Hargrave's careful hands, a will unsigned yet potent with implication. Across from her, Inspector Harrington leaned forward, his shrewd gaze flickering between the paper and the solicitor, Mr. Charles Redgrave, whose hands trembled slightly as they rested atop his ledger. Outside, the morning fog curled lazily around the village, cloaking it in an eerie quiet, as though the world itself hesitated to interrupt the revelation unfolding within. A distant clock chimed, its echo swallowed by the heavy silence in the study. "Mr. Redgrave," Evelyn said at last, her voice deceptively calm, each word measured, deliberate. "This draft suggests a very different future for Ashton Court than the one everyone assumed." The solicitor swallowed hard. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lord Edwin Ashford had every intention of leaving his estate to the university's historical society, with a considerable pension set aside for his loyal housekeeper, Mrs. Langley." He hesitated, his fingers tapping against the edge of the desk, as if weighing the very gravity of his next words. His nephew, James Ashford, was to be entirely disinherited. Silence followed, taut and heavy, the weight of those words sinking into the room, like an anchor dragging against the ocean floor. James Ashford, the heir apparent, stripped of his claim. It was a motive sharpened to a deadly point. Evelyn's fingers traced the edges of the document, the parchment dry and brittle beneath her touch. "And yet," she murmured, her gaze flicking to Inspector Harrington, "this document was never finalized." The inspector, who had been watching Redgrave with quiet intensity, finally spoke. "Which means that someone knew about its contents," he said, his voice a shade lower, "and had every reason to ensure it never reached completion." Redgrave exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. His chair creaked as he leaned forward, his knuckles blanching against the desk. "The final version," he began, then hesitated again. "It disappeared 2 nights before Lord Edwin's death," he confessed at last. "We assumed it was misplaced, but now," his voice trailed off, his gaze darkened with the weight of realization. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. A will stolen just before a sudden death. She turned to the inspector, her expression unreadable. "Tell me, Inspector, do you believe in coincidence?" Harrington's expression was grim. "Rarely," he admitted, "and never in matters involving inheritance." His gaze returned to the solicitor. "Do you recall the last person to inquire about this will?" Redgrave's brow furrowed in thought, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Mrs. Langley visited a week prior," he said carefully. "She seemed anxious. Lord Edwin had confided in her more than once. She wanted to be sure that his wishes would be honored. And James Ashford?" Evelyn pressed. "Had he ever expressed concerns?" Redgrave hesitated for the briefest of moments, just long enough for Evelyn to take notice. "He came by the day before the will vanished," he admitted. His voice was strained, as though the words carried a weight he had been unwilling to acknowledge before now. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, but inside the mystery only deepened. A stolen will, an heir who stood to lose everything, a death that had arrived just in time to ensure no changes could be made. The game had begun in earnest now, and Evelyn had no intention of losing. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried the scent of damp earth and fresh ink as Miss Marple stepped into the village post office, her sharp eyes scanning the quiet hum of routine life unfolding before her. Behind the wooden counter, Miss Edith Hart, the ever-efficient postmistress, sorted a fresh pile of letters, her fingers moving with habitual precision. At the sound of the door chime, she glanced up, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Ah, good afternoon, Miss Marple," she greeted warmly, though a shadow of curiosity flickered in her gaze. "I suppose you've heard about the rather unsettling events at Blackwood Hall." Miss Marple, ever the picture of gentle inquisitiveness, nodded with a knowing smile. "Quite a bit of talk, yes," she said, her tone light but with a subtle weight of purpose. "And I find myself with a particular curiosity about a telegram sent from there shortly before Mr. Blackwood's untimely passing." Miss Hart hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, her fingers pausing over an envelope before she carefully set it aside. "Ah," she murmured, glancing around as though ensuring they were alone. "That's rather interesting, actually. It wasn't from the widow, Mrs. Blackwood, nor the nephew, Henry. No, it was Edith, the maid." Her voice dropped ever so slightly. "She came in looking rather distressed that day. Didn't linger, didn't say much, just handed me the slip and paid in a hurry. The telegram was marked for urgent delivery." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though inwardly the revelation sent a fresh ripple through the tangled web of this mystery. "And do you recall to whom it was addressed?" she inquired, her voice steady. Miss Hart pursed her lips in thought before giving a small nod. "Yes, it was sent to a Mr. Algernon Fiske in London. Not a name I recognized, but—" She hesitated again, lowering her voice. "Miss Marple, I've seen enough troubled souls pass through here to know when someone is frightened." And Edith was frightened. Outside, the clouds thickened, casting shifting shadows through the lace-trimmed windows. Miss Marple tapped a gloved finger against her handbag, deep in thought. A secret telegram, a frightened maid, and a death that had shattered the peace of Blackwood Hall. There was no such thing as coincidence. With a grateful nod to Miss Hart, she turned on her heel and stepped out onto the village lane, her destination clear. By the time she arrived at Blackwood Hall, the once grand estate was shrouded in a hush of unease. The scent of damp stone and polished mahogany clung to the air as she stepped into the dimly lit drawing room, where Edith stood by the fireplace, hands clasped tightly. She started at Miss Marple's presence, but composed herself quickly. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Miss Marple regarded her with the quiet patience of a woman who had seen too many lies unravel before her eyes. "My dear, I know about the telegram," she said gently, but firmly. "I know you sent it. What I don't know is why." For a long moment, Edith said nothing. Then with a shuddering breath, her composure cracked. "I thought I was helping," she whispered. "I thought if Mr. Fiske knew what Henry was planning, he could stop it. Henry, he had been speaking of debts, of desperation. He needed money, and he was growing impatient." Her voice dropped further, and then suddenly Mr. Blackwood was dead. Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. "And you believed Henry had a hand in it?" Edith's gaze flickered with uncertainty. "I didn't want to, but he came to me that night, asked me if I had seen anything, kept insisting he'd been at the Red Lion all evening. But I know he wasn't." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in quiet understanding. "And what did Mr. Fiske say when he received your telegram?" Edith swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted. "He never replied." A chill ran through Miss Marple, not from the cold but from the pieces of the puzzle slowly snapping into place. A desperate air, a missing alibi. And now the name of a man who had remained silent through it all. The truth was close, tantalizingly close. Miss Marple straightened, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle in her coat. "Well, my dear," she said, her voice light yet edged with something unmistakable, "I do believe it's time I had a word with Mr. Henry Blackwood." And with that, she turned toward the waiting storm outside, ready to bring the truth to light. The evening mist clung to the cobbled streets of Ashford Hollow as Miss Eleanor Graves made her way toward the dimly lit post office, the faint glow of the gas lamps casting elongated shadows across the deserted square. Her arrival was unannounced, yet the postmistress, Mrs. Winfield, looked up from her ledger with the knowing gaze of someone who had been expecting trouble. "Ah, Miss Graves," she greeted, her fingers momentarily pausing over the stack of unsorted letters. "I suspect this visit has something to do with the affair at the Dunsley estate." Eleanor nodded, her expression composed but purposeful. "I need to confirm something, Mrs. Winfield. A telegram was sent from Dunsley Manor the night before Harold Dunsley's demise. Can you tell me who sent it?" The older woman hesitated, her hands tightening over the envelopes as though weighing the cost of her words. Then, glancing around to ensure no other ears lingered, she leaned in and whispered, "It wasn't Lady Margaret, nor young Edwin, it was Evelyn, the maid. She came in just before closing, looking as though she had seen a ghost." Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "Evelyn? And the telegram, was it urgent?" Mrs. Winfield nodded gravely, marked for immediate delivery. "She was trembling, Miss Graves. She didn't want to be seen." A flicker of intrigue crossed Eleanor's face. Evelyn had been so quiet during the interviews, too quiet. What had she known, and whom had she been trying to reach? The puzzle was shifting, aligning itself into something darker, more insidious than mere inheritance squabbles. With a polite nod, Eleanor left the post office, her mind racing. The mist had thickened, curling around the village like ghostly fingers as she strode toward Dunsley Manor, its grand silhouette looming against the night sky. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. She found Evelyn near the kitchen, her hands nervously twisting the hem of her apron. "Evelyn," Eleanor's voice was gentle yet firm. "I know you sent the telegram. It's time to tell me why." The maid's eyes widened, fear flickering across her delicate features before she dropped her gaze. "I thought I was helping," she whispered. "I didn't know, I didn't realize what would happen." Eleanor remained silent, allowing the tension to stretch, until finally, Evelyn inhaled shakily and continued. "It was Edwin. He asked me to send it. He said it was about his father's will, that something needed to be handled before morning. I didn't ask questions, I just did as I was told." Eleanor's breath caught. Evelyn, who was the telegram for? The maid swallowed hard. A solicitor in London. The revelation sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but one thing remained. What exactly had Edwin been so desperate to arrange? And how did it connect to his father's death? The answer lay with Edwin himself. She found him in the study, seated in the same chair where his father had once presided over the household affairs, his fingers drumming a restless beat against the polished mahogany desk. As Eleanor stepped inside, she placed something on the table before him, a brass fountain pen. Edwin's eyes flickered to it, his expression unreadable. "Do you recognize this?" she asked softly. His silence was telling. "It was found near your father's body, Edwin, a unique piece, bearing your initials." He exhaled sharply, his facade of indifference cracking ever so slightly. "I don't know how it got there," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor held his gaze. "You sent a telegram that night, arranging something, weren't you? Something that couldn't wait." Edwin's fingers clenched into fists. "I needed the will changed," he admitted finally, his voice raw. "My father was going to cut me out. I had to act. And did you?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, the air between them taut with the weight of the accusation. Edwin's breath hitched, his silence stretching unbearably long, until at last he whispered, "I never meant for him to die." The damning words hung in the air, and Eleanor knew the game was nearly over. The tangled web of deception, greed and fear had begun to unravel, and soon the truth would come crashing down like a house of cards. The mist coiled thick and unrelenting around Ashford Manor, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the dying light. A hush of unease settled over the estate, the kind that seeped into the bones and whispered of long-buried secrets. Eleanor Graves stepped through the towering iron gates, her heels clicking against the damp cobblestones, her keen gaze fixed on the darkened windows above. Something had festered within these walls for far too long. Tonight it would all come undone. Inside, the manor breathed with an eerie stillness, the scent of aged wood and smouldering embers hanging in the air. Candlelight flickered against the high-vaulted ceiling, casting distorted shadows along the mahogany-paneled walls. Eleanor's fingers trailed the fine grain of an antique desk, pausing at an almost imperceptible indentation near the edge. The mark was fresh, too fresh to be ignored. Across the room, Daniel Ashford sat by the fireplace, his fingers drumming against the armrest, his gaze flickering toward the dying embers, as if searching for something lost in the flames. "You received a letter the night of your father's murder," Eleanor said, her voice a blade of certainty slicing through the still air. "You were seen near the study moments before the fatal shot." Daniel's jaw tightened, a bead of sweat forming at his temple, despite the cool draft creeping through the corridors. "I told you, I never entered that room." His voice held an edge of defiance, but it wavered beneath the weight of her scrutiny. Eleanor reached into her coat, retrieving a scorched fragment of parchment. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the brittle fibers beneath her fingers. Though the fire had claimed much of it, the inked words remained visible, dark and damning. "You have until midnight to tell the truth, or I will." A clock somewhere in the manor chimed the hour, 9. Not midnight, but close enough for the air to prickle with tension. Eleanor stepped closer, the weight of silence pressing heavy upon them. "You weren't alone that night, were you?" Daniel exhaled sharply, his bravado cracking like brittle glass. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered, his fingers gripping the arms of the chair, as if steadying himself. "He pushed me too far. The confession quivered on his lips, but before it could take full shape, the parlor door creaked open. Victoria Ashford stood at the threshold, her silhouette dark against the gaslit hall. Her presence was an ice-cold ripple through the room, her expression unreadable. The air thickened as she stepped forward, her heels barely making a sound against the Persian rug. "Daniel," she murmured, her voice smooth as glass, sharp as steel. "You weren't the only one with something to lose." Eleanor turned sharply, her mind working faster than the ticking clock on the mantel. The pieces fell into place with unnerving clarity. This had never been about inheritance or power. It had been about silence, about keeping buried what should have never surfaced. And now, in the dying glow of the fire, the truth was unraveling, thread by thread, slipping through their grasp like smoke from the very flames that had failed to consume it. The room was stifling with the weight of revelation, the air thick with the smouldering remnants of deceit. Shadows danced erratically against the grand fireplace, its dying embers mirroring the flicker of dread in Lawrence Hawthorne's eyes. He knew, and more terrifyingly, she knew he knew. Eleanor Lockwood, draped in quiet certainty, let the silence stretch, watching as Lawrence's carefully constructed mask of composure fractured with every passing second. His fingers twitched at his side, his throat bobbing with the effort to swallow the truth he could no longer deny. "You were meticulous," Eleanor murmured, her voice smooth as polished glass, a near-perfect orchestration. The misplaced letter, the stage struggle, the broken lock, it all painted a picture you wanted us to see. But there was something you didn't account for. Lawrence's breath hitched. The others in the room, his mother, his brother Henry, and their longtime family solicitor, Arthur Pritchard, remained frozen, their gazes darting between him and Eleanor, as if waiting for the walls to collapse around them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lawrence said at last, his voice hoarse. Eleanor stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "The ink, Lawrence. The ink on the will wasn't dry when we found it. A document supposedly signed days before your father's death, yet fresh as if it had been prepared only hours prior. And then there's the timing, oh the timing," she said almost wistfully. "You ensured that Henry would arrive just late enough to find the body, conveniently placing suspicion elsewhere. But you forgot that I noticed the small things. The smudged print near the desk, the scuff on the floorboards near the hidden passage, the missing button from your cuff found at the scene of the crime." Lawrence exhaled sharply, his hands clenching at his sides. The silence in the room was suffocating now, thick as the storm brewing beyond the rain-streaked windows. "This is absurd," he tried, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "A collection of coincidences spun into some elaborate fantasy." Eleanor tilted her head, studying him like one would an insect under a magnifying glass. "No, Lawrence, it's the truth. And truth, unlike lies, does not bend to convenience. You forged the will, knowing your father planned to disinherit you. You confronted him that night, didn't you? The argument escalated, and when he threatened to expose you, you had no choice. A struggle ensued, the fireplace poker your weapon of opportunity. The blow wasn't planned, but in that moment, it was necessary, wasn't it?" A sharp gasp filled the room, his mother's. Her trembling hand reached for the chair beside her, as if the weight of her son's crime was too much to bear. Henry, his face pale, took an unsteady step forward. "Lawrence, tell me this isn't true," he pleaded. Lawrence's face twisted, his carefully constructed persona crumbling, his breath came shallow, his mind scrambling for a way out, but there was none. The walls had closed in, he was caught, his crimes exposed by a woman who saw past the illusions he had so carefully spun. Eleanor's gaze softened, just slightly. "Greed is a cruel master, Lawrence. It blinds men to what truly matters, makes them forget that wealth cannot replace the trust of those who once stood by them." Lawrence's shoulders sagged, defeat settling into his bones like a slow poison. He turned, his mother's tear-filled gaze searing into him, but there was no salvation left to be found in the quiet halls of Hawthorne Manor. Inspector Reed, silent until now, stepped forward, his hand steady as he reached for Lawrence's arm. "Lawrence Hawthorne, you are under arrest for the murder of Charles Hawthorne." Lawrence didn't resist. There was nothing left to fight for. As he was led away, the echoes of his footsteps fading into the corridor, Eleanor turned back to the room. The storm outside had begun to wane, but the house remained heavy with grief. The truth had been unearthed, yet the cost of knowing it would linger for years to come. It was a deep, dark night, with the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and the dim glow of distant lanterns barely flickering through the grimy windows of Purley Manor. Inside, the grandfather clock in the drawing room struck one for the last time when Inspector Alden spoke in a grave tone. "It was always meant to end this way, Mr. Linton." Samuel Linton, who had been sitting still and composed in his chair, let out a slow, measured smile, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Do you really think you understand, Inspector?" he asked, with a faint smirk, as if waiting for some grand revelation. But Miss Genevieve Hawthorne, affectionately known as Lady Hawthorne, remained motionless in her chair, lost in the shadow of an old forgotten dream. "You thought no one would ever see through you," she said in a cold, detached voice, "but every story has an ending, and you cannot escape the one you wrote for yourself, Mr. Linton." Inspector Alden placed his hand firmly on the polished desk. "You did it all for an inheritance, didn't you? You murdered Caroline Vance because she uncovered your truth, and then you turned a senseless killing into an unsolvable mystery. It seemed like a riddle with no answer, but in the end, it was just the work of a man who thought he could script his own fate." Samuel's smirk faded slightly, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest of his chair. "I must admit," he said, "you've done well, but let me ask you something, Inspector. If you knew the truth all along, why didn't you stop me before I made my final move?" Inspector Alden's voice remained calm and steady. "Because I never believed a man as cruel and remorseless as you could ever truly accept the consequences of his actions." For the first time that evening, Lady Hawthorne's composed exterior cracked. Her eyes burned with both fury and sorrow. "I gave you everything, Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and you gave me nothing but betrayal. This isn't just about one woman's death, not just about one crime. You have destroyed everything that could have made you human." Samuel Linton exhaled slowly, as if turning the final page of a story he had written himself. "So this is how it ends," he murmured. "A meaningless defeat." Inspector Alden placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his gaze carrying a trace of something close to mercy. "No, Mr. Linton," he said. "This isn't just defeat. This is justice." Purley Manor had long since returned to its quiet, untroubled existence. At least, that's what the villagers told themselves. The scandal that had gripped the town had faded, replaced by mundane conversations of baking mishaps and sermons, the kind of chatter that wove the delicate fabric of St. Michael's Hollow back together. But Miss Evelyn Marbury knew better. She sat at her garden bench, hands resting idly over her knitting, her sharp eyes following the ebb and flow of life outside her cottage. The children's laughter had returned to the green, merchants exchanged pleasantries over the clink of weighing scales, and the whispers, those ever-present lingering murmurs, had softened into something less scandalous but no less persistent. The name Victor Langley still found its way into hushed conversations, his downfall spoken of in careful undertones, a shadow that refused to fade entirely. It had been months since his arrest, since the night Miss Marbury had pieced together the truth that had eluded the authorities. The village had moved on, as it always did, but something about this return to normalcy felt incomplete. The world had not stopped turning, yet an unease lingered beneath the polished surface, an unanswered question lurking in the corners of every carefully averted glance. And then, as if the universe itself had been listening, the letter arrived. It slipped through her mail slot with a soft rustle, an unassuming white envelope, bearing the unmistakable script of Inspector Wren. She unfolded it slowly, her pulse steady, her mind already anticipating what lay within. A formal thank you as expected, a polite nod to her invaluable insights in the Langley case, yet, buried between the lines, there was something else, a hesitation, a final sentence that caught her eye. However, Miss Marbury, I find myself wondering, did we truly uncover everything? The question sat heavy in the air. She glanced toward the street, where life had resumed its predictable rhythm, where faces bore the ease of people content in their belief that all was well. But Miss Marbury felt it, the loose thread in the weave, the piece that didn't quite fit. Had they been too quick to close the book on Victor Langley's crime? Had the truth been only half revealed? The thought sent a familiar thrill down her spine. The village had found peace again, but Miss Marbury knew better than to trust quiet streets and settled dust. Because in places like St. Michael's Hollow, secrets were never buried for long, and as she set the letter aside and reached for her coat, she allowed herself a small knowing smile. The mystery wasn't over yet. The night draped itself over Ashcombe Hollow like a velvet curtain, the last remnants of twilight swallowed by the creeping embrace of darkness. Miss Eleanor Wakefield sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking softly in the hush of the evening, her gaze flickering between the familiar glow of gas lamps outside and the delicate weave of wool between her fingers. Patterns, she murmured absently to herself, they always emerge if you know where to look. And she had always known where to look. People thought they could conceal their truths behind polite smiles and carefully crafted words, but the truth had a way of seeping through, the nervous flutter of hands, the lingering glances that lasted a fraction too long, the hushed conversations cut abruptly short when a certain name was mentioned. In Ashcombe Hollow, every quiet street and every flickering lantern had a story to tell. The village had begun to settle for the night, though Miss Wakefield remained unconvinced that true peace had returned. The baker's wife had resumed her morning gossip rounds, the vicar once again spoke of sermons rather than scandals, and yet a certain unease clung to the air, almost imperceptible but unmistakable to those who knew how to listen. It had been 3 months since the tragedy, since the cold body of Andrew Sterling was found beneath the great oak at the edge of the village green, his secrets laid bare as the wind whispered through the branches. His killer had been caught, or so they all believed, but belief and truth were rarely the same thing. Inspector Wexley had been certain of his findings, had wrapped the case in a neat little package and presented it as justice, but Miss Wakefield had lived too long, seen too much to mistake convenience for certainty. There were too many loose threads, too many questions that had never been answered, and now as she sat in her chair, the wool slipping through her fingers in rhythmic precision, she felt the pull of something unfinished. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window pane, sending a scattering of dried leaves skittering across the cobblestone street outside. The last of the shopkeepers pulled in their shutters, the amber glow of oil lamps flickering as curtains were drawn and doors were bolted shut. Miss Wakefield's eyes lingered on the emptying square, where only moments ago a shadow had moved, quick, deliberate, disappearing around the bend where the butcher's shop stood in silence. She did not move from her seat, did not betray the shift in her thoughts, but the knowing gleam in her eyes sharpened ever so slightly. It was a peaceful night, or at least it wanted to be. But in places like Ashcombe Hollow, peace was often nothing more than an illusion, and mystery never truly slept.